Hi there, and welcome to Sleepy Philosophy. Tonight we venture into one of philosophy's most profound territories, a realm that touches every human heart, yet remains shrouded in mystery and fear. We're going to examine why death, the most natural conclusion to life, fills us with such profound unease. Before we begin this quiet journey together, I'm curious to know where in the world you're listening from tonight. There's something beautifully universal about these questions we're exploring. Questions that have kept philosophers awake for centuries while now helping you drift toward peaceful rest. If these gentle philosophical wanderings bring you comfort, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to join our community of thoughtful souls. To those already travelling with us, thank you for making this space what it is. Tonight's question is deceptively simple yet infinitely complex. Why do we fear death? It seems almost absurd when you think about it. Death is perhaps the only truly universal human experience, the one certainty we all share. Every person who has ever lived has faced this threshold. Every creature that draws breath will one day release it for the final time. Death is as natural as birth, as inevitable as sunrise, yet for most of us the mere thought of it sends a chill through our very being. This fear runs deeper than logic, deeper than reason. It whispers in quiet moments, surfaces in dreams, and colours our choices in ways we rarely acknowledge. We build entire civilizations partly as monuments against mortality. We create art to outlast our bodies, write books to preserve our thoughts, and have children to carry forward our essence. The fear of death shapes religion, drives scientific advancement, and influences every major decision we make about how to spend our precious limited time. But what exactly are we afraid of? Is it the process of dying with its potential for pain and suffering? Is it the unknown that lies beyond, that vast question mark, that no living person can answer with certainty? Or is it something else entirely, something that strikes at the very core of what we believe ourselves to be? The ancient Greek philosopher Epicurus, writing over 2,000 years ago, offered what might seem like a puzzling perspective on this fear. He suggested that death, properly understood, is nothing to us. His reasoning was elegantly simple. Good and evil, he argued, consist in sensation. Death is the absence of sensation. Therefore death cannot be good or evil for the person who dies. Where death is, we are not. Where we are, death is not. The two never actually meet. This might sound coldly logical, almost dismissive of our very real fears. Yet Epicurus wasn't trying to minimise the profound nature of death, or the grief that accompanies loss. He was attempting to show us that much of our fear might be based on a fundamental misunderstanding. We fear death as if it were an experience we will have, but by definition, it's the end of all experience. Think about it this way. You don't suffer from the billions of years that passed before you were born. That vast stretch of non-existence caused you no pain, no anxiety, no regret. Why should the non-existence that follows life be any different? Epicurus suggested that we often make the error of imagining ourselves somehow present to witness our own absence, standing ghost-like over our own graves, mourning what we've lost. But there's something that feels incomplete about this purely rational approach. While Epicurus may have solved the logical puzzle of fearing non-existence, he didn't fully address the deeper currents of our mortality anxiety. The fear of death isn't just about what happens after we die. It's intimately connected to how we understand life itself, to what we believe gives existence meaning and value. The German philosopher Martin Heidegger explored this territory with remarkable depth in the 20th century. For Heidegger, the awareness of death wasn't something to be overcome or dismissed. Instead, it was fundamental to authentic human existence. He distinguished between knowing about death as a general fact and truly confronting your own mortality. We all know intellectually that humans are mortal, but most of the time we live as if this knowledge doesn't apply to us personally. Heidegger called this everyday state of avoidance das Man, often translated as the they self. In this mode we lose ourselves in busyness, in social roles, in the endless chatter of daily life. Death becomes something that happens to other people, something statistical and distant. We know that people die, but somehow this knowledge doesn't penetrate to the core of how we live our own lives. But occasionally something breaks through this comfortable illusion. Perhaps it's a close call, a diagnosis, the sudden loss of someone we love. In these moments, Heidegger suggested, we encounter what he called being toward death. This isn't morbid preoccupation, but rather a profound awakening to the finite nature of our existence. When we truly grasp that our time is limited, that every moment is irreplaceable, life takes on a different quality entirely. This confrontation with mortality can be terrifying, but Heidegger argued it's also liberating. When we stop hiding from the fact of death, we become capable of what he called authentic existence. We begin to make choices based on what truly matters to us rather than what society expects or what keeps us comfortable. The awareness of death becomes not a source of paralysis, but a call to genuine living. Yet even this philosophical framework doesn't fully capture the complexity of our relationship with mortality. The fear of death operates on multiple levels simultaneously. There's the biological level, where every cell in our body is programmed for survival. There's the psychological level, where the ego struggles to comprehend its own dissolution. There's the social level, where death represents separation from everyone and everything we love. And there's what we might call the metaphysical level, where death confronts us with questions about the nature of existence itself. Consider the biological dimension first. Evolution has equipped us with powerful survival instincts. Fear in the face of mortal danger has kept our species alive for millennia. But human consciousness has created a unique problem. Unlike other animals, we can conceptualize our own future non-existence. We can imagine scenarios, anticipate outcomes, and project ourselves forward in time. This remarkable cognitive ability that allows us to plan and create also forces us to confront the ultimate limit of all our plans and creations. Our brains, shaped by millions of years of evolution to keep us alive, struggle to process the concept of their own termination. The very organ we use to think about death cannot truly comprehend a state in which it no longer functions. This creates what some philosophers call a cognitive paradox. We are beings who can conceive of our own inconceivability. The psychological dimension adds another layer of complexity. Much of what we call the self or ego is built around the assumption of continuity. We tell ourselves stories about who we are, where we're going, what we want to accomplish. These narratives give shape and meaning to our experience. Death represents the ultimate disruption of these stories. It's not just the ending of our tale, but the dissolution of the very narrator who tells it. Sigmund Freud explored this terrain in his work on what he called the death instinct. He observed that the human psyche seems to contain competing drives. On one hand, there's eros, the life force that pushes us toward growth, connection, and creation. On the other hand, there's thanatos, the drive toward dissolution, rest, and ultimately death. Freud suggested that these opposing forces create a fundamental tension within every human being. Whether or not we accept Freud's specific formulation, there's something compelling about this recognition of internal conflict around mortality. We want to live, to experience, to grow, and connect. Yet we also sometimes feel exhausted by the effort of existence, drawn toward the peace that non-being might represent. This isn't necessarily depression or suicidal ideation, but rather a recognition that consciousness itself can be a burden as well as a gift. The social dimension of death fear is perhaps the most immediately recognizable. Death means separation from everyone we love. It means missing out on future experiences with friends and family. It means leaving behind those who depend on us, disappointing those who believe in us, and breaking the bonds that give life much of its meaning. This social aspect of mortality anxiety reveals something profound about human nature. We are not isolated individuals, but beings who exist in relationship. Our sense of self is partly constructed through our connections with others. Death threatens not just our individual consciousness, but our entire web of relationships. When we fear death, we're partly fearing the grief we'll cause others and the connections we'll lose. There's also a temporal dimension to this social fear. Death represents the ultimate deadline. It's the final limit on our ability to repair relationships, express love, ask forgiveness, or share what we've learned. The fear of death often contains within it the fear of incompleteness, of stories left unfinished and words left unspoken. But perhaps the deepest layer of our mortality anxiety operates at what we might call the metaphysical level. Here, death confronts us with questions that go to the very heart of existence. What does it mean for consciousness to simply cease? How can something as vivid and immediate as subjective experience just stop? What happens to all the thoughts, memories and feelings that make up our inner world? These questions touch on some of the most fundamental problems in philosophy: the relationship between mind and matter, the nature of consciousness, the meaning of existence itself. When we fear death, we're not just afraid of personal annihilation, but of confronting the ultimate mystery of what it means to be at all. Different philosophical and religious traditions have approached these metaphysical questions in various ways. Some posit survival after death in the form of an immortal soul. Others suggest that consciousness is an illusion, and death simply reveals the truth of our fundamental non-existence. Still others propose that death is a transformation rather than a termination, a transition to some other mode of being. Yet regardless of our beliefs about what happens after death, the very fact that we can ask these questions reveals something remarkable about human consciousness. We are beings who can step outside of immediate experience and contemplate the conditions of our own existence. This capacity for self-reflection is part of what makes us human, but it also creates unique forms of anxiety and wonder. As we continue to explore these themes, we'll delve deeper into how different philosophers and traditions have grappled with mortality. We'll examine the various strategies humans have developed for coping with death anxiety, from the ancient Stoics to modern existentialists. We'll consider how the fear of death might actually serve as a gateway to more authentic and meaningful living. But for now, let these initial thoughts settle gently in your mind. The fear of death, far from being a weakness or failing, reveals the depth and complexity of human consciousness. It shows us how much we value existence, how deeply we're connected to others, and how profound are the questions that consciousness raises about its own nature. In our next exploration, we'll continue this journey, examining how awareness of mortality has shaped human culture, creativity, and the search for meaning. We'll see how confronting rather than avoiding our mortality might lead not to despair, but to a richer, more authentic way of being in the world. For centuries, humans have developed remarkable strategies for managing the weight of mortality. These aren't simply intellectual exercises, but lived approaches to one of our most fundamental challenges. The ancient Stoics, for instance, didn't shy away from death, but embraced it as a teacher. They practiced what they called memento mori, regularly contemplating their own mortality, not to become morbid, but to clarify what truly matters. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher emperor, wrote extensively about death in his personal journal, which we know today as the Meditations. He reminded himself that death comes to everyone, from the lowliest beggar to the most powerful ruler. This wasn't pessimism, but perspective. By accepting mortality as the natural order, he found freedom from the anxiety that comes with fighting the inevitable. The Stoics understood that much of our suffering around death comes not from death itself, but from our resistance to its reality. Consider how this shifts our relationship with time. When we truly accept that our days are numbered, each moment becomes more precious, not less. The Stoics spoke of living each day as if it might be your last, not in a frantic, desperate way, but with intentionality and presence. They recognized that the awareness of death could serve as a compass, pointing us toward what deserves our attention and energy. This perspective finds echoes across cultures and centuries. The Buddhist tradition speaks of impermanence as one of the fundamental characteristics of existence. Everything that arises will pass away. This includes not just our individual lives, but everything we hold dear. Cities crumble, civilizations fade, even stars eventually burn out. At first glance, this might seem like a recipe for nihilism or despair. If nothing lasts, why does anything matter? Yet Buddhist philosophy suggests the opposite. It's precisely because things are impermanent that they become precious. A flower's beauty is intensified by its brief blooming. A moment of connection with a loved one becomes more meaningful when we recognize it won't last forever. The Buddhist approach to death anxiety involves developing what they call equanimity, a balanced acceptance of both arising and passing away. This doesn't mean becoming emotionally numb or detached. Rather, it means learning to love fully while holding lightly. We can experience deep connection and profound joy while simultaneously accepting that these experiences are temporary. This might sound paradoxical, but many who practice this way of being report that it actually increases rather than decreases their capacity for engagement with life. The existentialist philosophers of the 20th century brought a different but related perspective to these questions. Jean-Paul Sartre famously declared that existence precedes essence, meaning that we exist first, and then create meaning through our choices and actions. From this viewpoint, the fact that life ends doesn't diminish its significance, but rather makes our freedom to choose who we become all the more important. Sartre's contemporary Albert Camus wrestled with what he called the absurd, the conflict between human desire for meaning and the universe's apparent silence about ultimate purpose. Death epitomizes this absurdity. We long for significance in a cosmos that will eventually erase all trace of our existence. Yet Camus didn't counsel despair but defiance. He suggested we should imagine Sisyphus happy, finding joy in the very act of rolling the boulder up the mountain, even knowing it will roll back down. This existentialist approach to mortality suggests that the absence of inherent meaning doesn't make life meaningless, but rather makes us the creators of meaning. Death becomes not a negation of significance, but a boundary that gives shape to our self-creation. The sculptor needs the limits of the stone to create art. Perhaps consciousness needs the limits of mortality to create meaning. But we needn't look only to formal philosophy for wisdom about death. Literature, art, and music have long served as laboratories for exploring mortality. The great poets have often found in death not just sorrow but beauty, not just ending but transformation. John Keats, writing while dying young of tuberculosis, created some of the most beautiful meditations on mortality in the English language. His Ode to a Nightingale explores the contrast between human mortality and the seemingly eternal song of the bird, yet finds in this very contrast a source of profound beauty. Shakespeare's plays return again and again to themes of death and time. Hamlet's famous soliloquy, "To be or not to be," is perhaps the most quoted meditation on mortality in Western literature. Yet Shakespeare doesn't present death as purely negative. In plays like The Tempest, he explores how the awareness of life's brevity can lead to forgiveness, reconciliation, and a deeper appreciation for what time we have. Visual artists have long been fascinated by mortality as well. From medieval paintings of the dance of death to modern works exploring the relationship between time and memory, art has served as a way of processing and transforming our anxiety about ending. These works don't typically provide easy answers, but rather create spaces for contemplation, allowing us to approach the mystery of death through beauty rather than pure logic. Music, perhaps more than any other art form, seems to capture something essential about the temporal nature of existence. A melody exists only in time, unfolding moment by moment, impossible to grasp all at once. Like life itself, music is about pattern emerging through time, about themes that develop and resolve. The greatest musical works often seem to say something profound about mortality, without using words at all. These artistic explorations suggest that our relationship with death might be more complex than simple fear. Yes, we're afraid, but we're also fascinated. Death appears in our dreams, our stories, our deepest creative expressions. It's as if consciousness is drawn to contemplate its own limits, like touching the edges of a wound to understand its dimensions. This fascination reveals something important about human nature. We are meaning-making creatures, constantly trying to understand our place in the larger scheme of things. Death represents perhaps the ultimate question about meaning. If everything ends, what's the point of anything? Yet this very question drives much of what makes human life distinctive. Our awareness of mortality seems to intensify, rather than diminish our search for significance. Consider how differently we might live if we were immortal. Would anything feel urgent or important if we had infinite time? Would relationships have the same depth if we knew they would never end through loss? Would creativity flourish in the same way if there were no deadline to work against? The pressure of mortality, uncomfortable as it is, might be partly responsible for the intensity and beauty of human experience. This isn't to romanticize death or suggest that mortality is purely positive. The pain of loss is real, the fear of suffering is legitimate, and the grief that accompanies death touches the deepest parts of our humanity. Rather, it's to recognize that our relationship with mortality is more nuanced than simple terror. Within our fear lies also love. Within our anxiety about ending lies also appreciation for what we have while we have it. The terror management theorists in psychology have explored how much of human behavior can be understood as attempts to manage death anxiety. We create culture, build monuments, have children, and achieve recognition partly as ways of achieving symbolic immortality. Even if our bodies die, something of us continues in the institutions we build, the people we influence and the works we create. Yet this perspective, while illuminating, might still not capture the full picture. Perhaps our deepest response to mortality isn't the desire to escape it, but to meet it authentically. The philosophers and artists who have grappled most deeply with death often seem to find in it not just challenge but invitation. An invitation to live more fully, love more deeply, and engage more genuinely with the mystery of existence. As we continue to explore these profound questions, we move into territory where philosophy meets psychology, where ancient wisdom encounters modern insight, and where the deepest fears of the human heart reveal themselves to be intimately connected with our capacity for meaning, beauty, and love. The fear of death, properly understood, might be another name for the love of life. In our continuing journey, we'll examine how different spiritual traditions have approached these questions, how modern neuroscience is beginning to understand the mechanisms of mortality awareness, and how we might cultivate a relationship with death that enhances rather than diminishes our capacity for living. For now, let these thoughts rest gently in your consciousness, like seeds planted in fertile soil, ready to grow in the quiet spaces of reflection and sleep. The question of why we fear death becomes even more intriguing when we consider the role of the unknown. Much of what terrifies us about mortality isn't death itself, but the vast uncertainty that surrounds it. We are creatures who find comfort in knowledge, in understanding patterns and predicting outcomes. Death represents the ultimate unknown, a threshold beyond which no reliable information returns. This uncertainty manifests in countless ways throughout human culture. We create elaborate mythologies about what happens after death, not necessarily because we have evidence for these beliefs, but because the human mind seems unable to tolerate complete mystery about something so fundamental to our existence. The afterlife concepts found across cultures, from Egyptian underworlds to Christian heavens to Buddhist reincarnation cycles, all serve partly as maps for the unmappable territory beyond life. Yet perhaps our need to know what comes after death reveals something profound about consciousness itself. We are beings who live primarily in mental representations of reality, rather than in immediate physical sensation. Our minds are constantly creating models of the world, predicting what will happen next, planning for future scenarios. This remarkable capacity allows us to navigate complex social situations, build civilizations, and create art. But it also means we cannot easily accept the possibility that consciousness itself might simply cease. The French philosopher Emmanuel Levinas offered a different perspective on this mystery. He suggested that death is not primarily about the ending of the self, but about encountering what he called the face of the other. For Levinas, our deepest ethical awakening comes when we recognize that others are mortal beings, vulnerable and finite like ourselves. This recognition of shared mortality becomes the foundation of all genuine human connection and moral responsibility. This insight shifts our focus from the self-centered fear of our own death to a more relational understanding of mortality. When we truly grasp that everyone we love will die, that every person we encounter is living under the same ultimate constraint, something profound happens to how we see the world. The casual cruelties we might inflict on others become harder to justify. The importance of kindness and understanding increases. The preciousness of shared time becomes undeniable. Consider how this awareness might transform a simple conversation with a friend. Knowing that both of you are temporary beings in a vast cosmos, that your time together is limited and irreplaceable, could infuse even mundane exchanges with a quality of tenderness and attention. This isn't morbid preoccupation, but rather a form of awakening to the true conditions under which all human relationships exist. The philosopher Emmanuel Levinas wasn't alone in recognizing this relational dimension of mortality. The African philosophical tradition of Ubuntu, often summarized as "I am because we are," suggests that individual identity is fundamentally interconnected with community. From this perspective, the fear of death isn't just about personal annihilation, but about the breaking of bonds that constitute our very being. This communal understanding of mortality appears in many indigenous wisdom traditions. Rather than seeing death as the private concern of the individual, these cultures often view it as a community event that requires collective processing and support. The dying person doesn't face the transition alone, and the community doesn't simply move on after loss, but integrates the experience of mortality into its ongoing life. Western culture, with its emphasis on individual achievement and personal identity, sometimes struggles with this more relational approach to death. We often treat mortality as a private matter, something to be faced alone or with minimal support. This isolation might actually intensify death anxiety by cutting us off from the very connections that could provide comfort and meaning in the face of life's brevity. But even within Western thought, there have been philosophers who recognised the social dimensions of mortality. The German thinker Hannah Arendt wrote extensively about what she called the human condition, emphasising that we are fundamentally beings who exist in relationship with others. For Arendt, one of the tragedies of death is that it removes unique individuals from the web of human relationships that gives life much of its meaning. Yet Arendt also identified something hopeful in human mortality. Because we die, she argued, we are motivated to create things that outlast us. Art, institutions, ideas and relationships all serve as ways of transcending individual mortality through collective human memory and culture. The fact that we won't be here forever makes us want to contribute something lasting to the ongoing human story. This perspective suggests that the fear of death might actually be productive rather than simply destructive. It motivates us to love more deeply, create more authentically, and connect more genuinely with others. The urgency that comes with awareness of life's limits can spark rather than suppress our highest human capacities. Modern psychology has begun to explore these dynamics through what researchers call post-traumatic growth. Studies of people who have faced serious illness or loss often reveal that confronting mortality, while initially devastating, can lead to profound positive changes. People report deeper relationships, clearer priorities, greater appreciation for simple pleasures, and a stronger sense of spiritual connection. This doesn't mean we should minimise the genuine pain and fear that accompany thoughts of death. The anxiety is real, and the losses are profound. Rather, it suggests that within our mortality, anxiety lies the seed of something transformative. The very intensity of our fear of death might reflect the intensity of our love for life. Consider the Japanese aesthetic concept of mono no aware, often translated as the pathos of things, or the bittersweet awareness of impermanence. This sensibility finds beauty precisely in the transient nature of existence. The falling cherry blossoms are beautiful not despite their brief blooming, but because of it. The elderly person's lined face tells a story that could only be written by time. The child's laughter is precious, partly because childhood is so fleeting. This aesthetic approach to mortality doesn't deny the sadness of endings, but finds within that sadness a particular kind of beauty. It's an approach that neither avoids death anxiety nor wallows in it, but transforms it into a deeper appreciation for the preciousness of what exists now, in this moment, before it changes or passes away. The neuroscientist Antonio Damasio has written about what he calls the feeling of what happens, exploring how consciousness creates a continuous sense of self through the integration of bodily sensations, emotions, and thoughts. From this perspective, the fear of death might be understood as the ultimate threat to this integration. Death represents not just the end of thinking, but the dissolution of the entire neurological symphony that creates our sense of being someone. Yet even this scientific understanding doesn't diminish the mystery. We can map the neural correlates of consciousness, but the subjective experience of being aware remains as mysterious as ever. The hard problem of consciousness, as philosophers call it, is the question of why there is something it is like to be us, rather than nothing at all. Death forces us to confront the possibility that this something it is like might simply vanish. But perhaps this very mystery is part of what makes consciousness so remarkable. We are matter that has become aware of itself, atoms that have organised into patterns capable of wonder, love, and reflection. The fact that such organisation is temporary doesn't make it less miraculous, but might make it more so. The contemporary philosopher Thomas Nagel has argued that consciousness represents something genuinely unprecedented in the natural world. It's not just more complex than other natural phenomena, but qualitatively different. From this perspective, the emergence of awareness in a previously unconscious universe is so remarkable that its temporary nature doesn't diminish its significance. This scientific wonder at consciousness echoes themes we find in spiritual traditions worldwide. Many mystical approaches to death suggest that what we fear losing in death, our sense of separate selfhood, might actually be an illusion. From this view, death doesn't destroy consciousness, but reveals its true nature as something larger than individual identity. The Sufi poet Rumi wrote extensively about death as a kind of homecoming. a return to the source from which consciousness originally emerged. His famous lines about being like a reed flute, creating beautiful music through the holes that represent our wounds and losses, suggest that even our mortality might serve a larger purpose we cannot fully understand. Whether or not we accept such metaphysical speculations, there's something profound in the recognition that consciousness, however temporary, represents an extraordinary development in the cosmos. For a brief time, the universe becomes aware of itself through beings like us. We are the cosmos reflecting on its own nature, matter contemplating its own existence, time becoming conscious of its own passage. This perspective doesn't eliminate the fear of death, but places it in a larger context. We are not just individuals facing personal annihilation, but temporary manifestations of something larger than ourselves. Our mortality anxiety becomes not just a personal problem, but a cosmic question about the nature of awareness itself. As we continue to explore these profound territories, we find that the fear of death opens into questions about the nature of time, consciousness, love, and meaning. What began as anxiety about personal ending becomes an investigation into the deepest mysteries of existence itself. The very fact that we can be afraid of death reveals something remarkable about what we are. In our ongoing journey through these philosophical landscapes, we'll explore how different traditions have understood the relationship between mortality and meaning, how we might cultivate wisdom in the face of uncertainty, and how the awareness of death might serve not as a source of paralysis, but as an invitation to more authentic living. These are not questions that admit of easy answers, but rather invitations to deeper contemplation about what it means to be conscious, mortal beings in a vast and mysterious universe. For now, let these reflections settle into the quiet spaces of your mind, like leaves falling gently onto still water. The fear of death, however uncomfortable, connects us to the deepest questions about existence, consciousness, and what it means to be human. In embracing rather than avoiding these questions, we might find not answers, but something perhaps more valuable, a deeper appreciation for the extraordinary fact that we exist at all, here and now, aware and wondering. The relationship between mortality and meaning reveals itself most clearly when we examine how the knowledge of death shapes human creativity and connection. Throughout history, the greatest works of human imagination have emerged not despite our mortality, but because of it. The Renaissance painters who created masterpieces understood that their time was limited, that their hands would one day grow still. The composers who wrote symphonies that move us to tears knew that their ability to hear and create was temporary. The poets whose words still echo across centuries grasped that language itself was their only hope of speaking beyond the grave. This creative urgency born from mortality awareness suggests something profound about human nature. We are not just beings who happen to be mortal, but beings whose mortality is intimately connected to our capacity for transcendence. The knowledge that we will die seems to awaken in us a desire to create something that will not die, to leave traces of our inner world that might outlast our physical presence. Consider how this dynamic plays out in the most intimate relationships. When we love someone deeply, part of what makes that love so intense is the knowledge that it exists within the boundaries of time. The couple growing old together finds sweetness in shared glances precisely because they know these moments are numbered. The parent watching a child grow experiences joy tinged with melancholy, understanding that childhood is a country we can visit only once and never return to. This temporal quality of love might explain why relationships threatened by loss often become more vivid, more present. When someone we care about faces illness or danger, our attention to them sharpens remarkably. We notice details we might otherwise overlook, speak words we might otherwise leave unsaid. The prospect of losing someone strips away the casual assumptions that usually govern our interactions, revealing the preciousness that was always there but often hidden beneath the surface of ordinary days. The ancient Greeks had a concept called kairos, which refers to the supreme or opportune moment, the right time for something to happen. This was distinguished from chronos, ordinary sequential time measured by clocks and calendars. Kairos moments are those instances when time seems to stop, when we become fully present to what is happening right now. These moments often arise when we are acutely aware of impermanence, when the knowledge of mortality breaks through our usual distraction and calls us into full presence. Think of standing beside the ocean at sunset, watching the light change moment by moment across the water. There's something about the ephemeral nature of the scene that demands attention, We don't photograph sunsets because they last forever, but precisely because they don't. The beauty lies partly in the knowing that this particular arrangement of light and colour will never exist again in exactly this way. This aesthetic dimension of mortality awareness appears in cultures worldwide. The Japanese tea ceremony finds profound meaning in the simple preparation and sharing of tea, understanding that this particular gathering of these particular people will never happen again. Each gesture becomes ceremonial not because it's elaborate, but because it's unrepeatable. The Islamic tradition speaks of the present moment as a gift from the divine, something to be received with gratitude precisely because it is fleeting. But our mortality awareness doesn't just intensify positive experiences, it also shapes how we understand suffering and loss. The Buddhist teaching that life contains suffering becomes more bearable when paired with the recognition that all conditions are impermanent. The pain we experience now will not last forever, just as the joy we remember from yesterday could not be sustained indefinitely. Mortality creates both the condition for suffering and the promise of its eventual end. This doesn't mean we should be passive in the face of pain or injustice. Rather, it suggests that our responses to difficulty might be more skillful when informed by an understanding of impermanence. The parent grieving a child's death doesn't suffer less by knowing that grief will eventually transform, but might find some comfort in understanding that the intensity of current pain reflects the depth of love, and that both the love and the pain are part of the larger mystery of conscious beings caring for one another in a temporary world. The Stoic philosophers understood this principle deeply. They practiced what they called the discipline of desire, learning to want what actually happens rather than demanding that reality conform to their preferences. This wasn't resignation or passivity, but rather a recognition that much of our suffering comes not from events themselves, but from our resistance to the fact that all things change and pass away. Marcus Aurelius wrote in his private notes that we suffer more in imagination than reality. Much of our death anxiety might fall into this category. We create elaborate scenarios of suffering, loss and dissolution that may bear little resemblance to actual experience. The anticipatory anxiety about mortality often causes more distress than the reality it anticipates. This insight doesn't eliminate the fear, but might help us hold it more lightly. Yet we should be careful not to dismiss death anxiety too quickly, or treat it as simply irrational. The fear of death might serve important psychological and social functions. It motivates us to take care of our bodies, to seek medical attention when needed, to avoid unnecessary risks. It drives us to create meaning, build relationships, and contribute to something larger than ourselves. The anxiety about mortality might be uncomfortable, but it's also intimately connected to what makes us most human. The contemporary philosopher Ernest Becker explored this territory in his work on what he called the denial of death. Becker argued that much of human civilization can be understood as an elaborate defense against mortality awareness. We create cultural symbols, institutions, and belief systems that promise some form of immortality, whether literal or symbolic. The scientist seeks truth that will outlast their lifetime. The artist creates works that might survive their death. The parent invests in children who will carry forward something of their essence. But Becker also recognized that this denial, while psychologically necessary, comes with costs. When we invest too heavily in immortality projects, we can become rigid, defensive, and unable to tolerate different ways of managing mortality anxiety. Religious wars, political fanaticism, and cultural intolerance might all be understood partly as conflicts between different systems for denying or transcending death. This perspective suggests that wisdom about mortality involves finding a middle path between complete denial and overwhelming anxiety. We need enough awareness of death to motivate authentic living, but not so much that we become paralyzed by fear. We need immortality projects that give life meaning without becoming so attached to them that we lose flexibility and compassion. The mindfulness traditions offer practical approaches to this balance. By learning to observe our thoughts and feelings without being completely identified with them, we can notice death anxiety when it arises without being overwhelmed by it. We can acknowledge the fear while also recognizing that it's one experience among many, arising and passing away like all mental phenomena. This observational stance toward mortality anxiety doesn't eliminate it, but changes our relationship to it. Instead of being afraid of death, we can simply notice that fear is present, investigate it with curiosity, and allow it to be part of the larger landscape of human experience. This shift from resistance to acceptance often paradoxically reduces the intensity of the fear itself. The practice of meditation offers another window into these questions. Many people who meditate regularly report experiences of expanded awareness that seem to transcend ordinary boundaries of selfhood. In deep meditative states, the usual sense of being a separate individual located in a particular body at a specific point in time can fade, replaced by a more spacious awareness that doesn't seem to depend on personal identity. These experiences don't necessarily prove anything about what happens after death, but they do suggest that consciousness might be more flexible and less bounded than our ordinary experience suggests. If awareness can expand beyond its usual limits during life, perhaps the dissolution of individual consciousness at death might not be the complete annihilation we fear, but rather a different kind of transformation. The mystics across traditions have long reported experiences that seem to point beyond individual mortality. Whether described as union with the divine, dissolution into cosmic consciousness, or recognition of fundamental emptiness, these experiences suggest that what we take to be our solid, separate self might be more like a wave on the ocean of awareness, distinct but not ultimately separate from the larger body of water. Such mystical perspectives offer comfort to some and seem foreign to others. We need not accept any particular metaphysical interpretation of these experiences to recognize that they point to something important about the nature of consciousness and identity. Even from a purely secular perspective, the recognition that our sense of self is constructed rather than fixed can provide some relief from mortality anxiety. If what we call the self is actually a process rather than a thing, a verb rather than a noun, then death becomes less like the destruction of an entity and more like the ending of a particular pattern of activity. This doesn't eliminate the sadness of endings, but it might make them feel less catastrophic. Patterns end, but the underlying capacity for pattern making continues. The contemporary neuroscientist Sam Harris has written about experiences of selflessness that can arise even without formal meditation practice. In moments of deep absorption in music, art, nature, or love, the usual boundaries of selfhood can temporarily dissolve, leaving awareness present but not centered on a particular identity. These glimpses suggest that the self we fear losing in death might be less solid and permanent than we usually imagine. Yet we should be cautious about using such insights to bypass the genuine emotional reality of mortality anxiety. The fear of death operates on multiple levels simultaneously, and intellectual understanding alone rarely eliminates emotional responses that are rooted in our biological and psychological evolution. The goal isn't to transcend all fear, but to develop a wiser relationship with the fears we naturally experience as mortal beings. Perhaps the most profound insight about death anxiety is that it reveals something beautiful about human consciousness. We fear death partly because we love life, because we're capable of caring deeply about our experience and our connections with others. The intensity of our mortality anxiety might actually be proportional to the intensity of our capacity for love, meaning, and joy. From this perspective, learning to live with death anxiety becomes part of learning to live with love itself. Both involve opening ourselves to experiences that we cannot fully control or predict. Both require us to invest deeply in relationships and projects that we know will eventually end. Both ask us to find meaning and beauty in the midst of uncertainty and impermanence. The fear of death, properly understood, might thus be seen not as a problem to be solved, but as a signal to be honoured. It points us toward what we most value, reminds us of the preciousness of our time, and calls us to live with greater presence and intentionality. Rather than trying to eliminate this anxiety, perhaps we can learn to dance with it, allowing it to inform our choices without letting it paralyze our actions. As we continue exploring these profound territories, we discover that every question about death opens into larger questions about consciousness, meaning, love, and the nature of existence itself. The fear that seemed so personal and isolated reveals itself to be connected to the deepest mysteries that conscious beings can contemplate. In learning to face mortality with greater wisdom and grace, we might also be learning to live with greater authenticity and depth. The exploration of mortality reveals something remarkable about human nature. We are perhaps the only creatures who can simultaneously experience the present moment while being acutely aware that it will not last forever. This temporal consciousness creates what we might call the paradox of mortal awareness. We are beings who can step outside the flow of time to contemplate time itself, yet we remain trapped within its relentless current. This unique position gives rise to what philosophers have called temporal anxiety. Unlike other fears that focus on specific threats, the fear of death encompasses our entire relationship with time itself. We fear not just the moment of dying, but the accumulation of moments that lead toward that inevitable conclusion. Every birthday becomes a marker of diminishment as well as celebration. Every goodbye carries within it the shadow of final farewell. The ancient philosopher Heraclitus observed that we cannot step into the same river twice, because it is not the same river, and we are not the same person. This insight cuts to the heart of why mortality feels so threatening. If everything is constantly changing, including ourselves, then what exactly are we trying to preserve when we fear death? The person who began reading this reflection is already gone, replaced by someone slightly different who has absorbed these ideas and been changed by them. This recognition of constant flux might initially seem to intensify our mortality anxiety. If we're always dying and being reborn in small ways, if the self is more like a river than a rock, then perhaps death is happening all the time rather than just at the end of life. Yet many wisdom traditions have found in this realization not cause for despair, but for liberation. If we're already comfortable with small deaths and rebirths, the final transition might feel less catastrophic. The Buddhist teacher Thich Nhat Hanh offered a beautiful metaphor for this process. He suggested that we are like clouds in the sky, constantly changing form, sometimes gathering into dramatic thunderheads, sometimes dispersing into wisps so thin they're barely visible. A cloud doesn't die when it becomes rain, he observed. It simply transforms into a different manifestation of the same underlying water. Perhaps consciousness operates according to similar principles, never truly disappearing but only changing form. This perspective doesn't require belief in any particular afterlife or reincarnation doctrine. It simply invites us to consider whether the sharp boundary we usually draw between existence and non-existence might be less absolute than we imagine. The atoms that make up our bodies existed long before we were born and will continue existing long after we die. The thoughts we think build upon countless generations of human reflection. The love we give and receive participates in patterns of connection that extend far beyond individual lifetimes. Modern science offers its own version of this insight. The law of conservation of energy tells us that energy can neither be created nor destroyed, only transformed from one state to another. The complex organization of energy that we call consciousness may indeed dissolve at death, but the energy itself continues in new forms. This doesn't provide the personal immortality that might comfort our egos, but it does suggest that we participate in processes larger and more enduring than individual identity. The fear of death often contains within it the fear of meaninglessness. If our lives are brief flickers in cosmic time, if our individual stories will eventually be forgotten, then why do our choices and experiences matter? This question has haunted human consciousness since we first developed the capacity to contemplate our own finitude. Yet the question itself might reveal something profound about what we are. The very fact that we can ask about meaning suggests that we are meaning-making creatures. We don't just experience events, we interpret them, weave them into stories, find patterns and significance in what might otherwise seem random. This capacity for meaning-making appears to be one of consciousness's most distinctive features. Even in the face of cosmic indifference, we continue to create significance through our attention, our care, our choices about what deserves our concern. Viktor Frankl, who survived the Nazi concentration camps, wrote extensively about this human capacity to create meaning even in the most extreme circumstances. He observed that those who survived the camps were not necessarily the physically strongest, but often those who maintained some sense of purpose, some reason for living that transcended immediate suffering. This purpose didn't have to be grand or universal. It could be as simple as the desire to reunite with a loved one or to bear witness to what had happened. Frankl's insights suggest that the search for meaning is not a luxury of comfortable circumstances, but a fundamental human need that persists even when everything else is stripped away. The fear of death might thus be partly a fear that our individual meaning-making will cease, that the unique way each consciousness interprets and responds to existence will be lost forever. Yet even this loss might be less total than we imagine. The meanings we create don't exist in isolation, but emerge through our interactions with others and our environment. the parent who teaches a child to see beauty in a sunset, the teacher who helps a student understand a difficult concept, the friend who listens with genuine attention during a moment of crisis. All these interactions leave traces that continue beyond individual lifetimes. This suggests that meaning-making might be not just a personal activity, but a collective one. We participate in larger conversations about significance that began before we were born, and will continue after we die. Our individual contributions to these ongoing discussions might be temporary, but the conversations themselves have a different kind of permanence. We are temporary voices in an enduring dialogue about what matters and why. The recognition of our participation in something larger than ourselves appears across cultures and philosophical traditions. The Confucian emphasis on social harmony and continuity across generations reflects this understanding. The African concept of Ubuntu, that we become human through our connections with others, points in a similar direction. Even the Western emphasis on individual rights and freedoms assumes that we participate in communities of meaning that transcend particular persons. This social dimension of mortality offers both comfort and challenge. On one hand, it suggests that our deaths need not mean the complete disappearance of everything we've contributed to human understanding and connection. On the other hand, it reminds us that others we care about are also mortal, that entire ways of life and understanding can be lost when communities disappear or cultures are destroyed. The 20th century provided devastating examples of how fragile human meaning-making can be. Genocides, cultural destructions, and the loss of indigenous wisdom traditions remind us that mortality operates not just at the individual level, but at the collective level as well. Languages die, taking with them unique ways of understanding the world. Traditions disappear, carrying away accumulated wisdom about how to live well. The fear of death extends beyond personal annihilation to include anxiety about the loss of everything humans have learned about meaning and value. Yet these losses also reveal something remarkable about human resilience. Even in the face of systematic attempts to destroy cultures and communities, meaning-making reasserts itself. Survivors find ways to preserve and transmit what matters most. New forms of understanding emerge from the fragments of what was lost. The capacity to create significance appears to be more robust than any particular expression of it. This resilience suggests that while individual consciousness may be fragile, the processes that give rise to consciousness and meaning might be more enduring. Evolution produced beings capable of love, creativity, and moral reflection once. Even if our particular species doesn't survive forever, the universe has already demonstrated its capacity to organize matter into forms capable of wonder and care. The contemporary philosopher Thomas Metzinger has written about what he calls the phenomenal self-model, the brain's representation of itself as a unified experiencing subject. From this neuroscientific perspective, the self we fear losing in death is already a kind of construction, a useful fiction created by our nervous system to help us navigate a complex world. This doesn't make our experience less real or valuable, but it does suggest that the boundaries of selfhood might be more flexible than we usually imagine. If the self is indeed a model rather than a thing, then death might involve not the destruction of an entity, but the dissolution of a particular pattern of neural activity. This reframing doesn't eliminate the sadness of endings, but it might make them seem less catastrophic. Patterns end, but the underlying capacity for pattern making continues in other forms. The meditation teacher Joseph Goldstein often speaks about consciousness as being like space itself, vast and open, capable of containing all experiences without being defined by any particular content. From this perspective, thoughts, emotions, and sensations arise and pass away within awareness like clouds moving through an empty sky. The clouds are temporary, but the sky remains. This metaphor points toward experiences that many contemplatives report, moments when the usual sense of being a bounded self temporarily dissolves, leaving awareness present but not centered on any particular identity. These experiences don't prove anything definitive about what happens after death, but they do suggest that consciousness might be more spacious and less dependent on individual identity than our ordinary experience suggests. Whether or not such mystical perspectives accurately describe the nature of consciousness, they offer practical benefits for those struggling with mortality anxiety. By learning to identify less completely with the contents of consciousness and more with awareness itself, we might find some relief from the fear of losing what we think we are. The practice of mindfulness offers a gentler entry point into these insights. By simply observing our thoughts and feelings without immediately identifying with them, we begin to notice that there's something in us that remains constant even as mental contents change. This observing awareness doesn't seem to age or deteriorate in the same way that our bodies and minds do. It's present in childhood and remains present in old age, witnessing all the changes without itself being changed. This witnessing awareness might offer a clue about what's most essential in human consciousness. It's not the particular thoughts we think or the specific emotions we feel, but the capacity for awareness itself that seems most fundamental. And this capacity appears to be less personal and bounded than we usually imagine. In deep states of meditation or contemplation, many people report that awareness seems to expand beyond its usual limits, suggesting that what we take to be individual consciousness might be part of a larger field of awareness. Such experiences need not be interpreted in any particular metaphysical framework to provide comfort in the face of mortality. Even from a purely secular perspective, the recognition that consciousness is more spacious and less bounded than we usually imagine can provide some relief from the claustrophobic fear of individual annihilation. The contemporary neuroscientist Christoph Koch has written about what he calls integrated information theory, which suggests that consciousness might be a fundamental feature of the universe rather than something that emerges only in complex brains. From this perspective, awareness might be present in varying degrees throughout nature, with human consciousness representing a particularly rich and integrated form of something more universal. If consciousness is indeed fundamental rather than emergent, then death might involve not the disappearance of awareness, but rather its return to less integrated forms. This doesn't provide the personal survival that might comfort our egos, but it does suggest that the capacity for experience itself might be more enduring than individual minds. These scientific speculations echo themes found in many wisdom traditions. The Hindu concept of Brahman suggests that individual consciousness is ultimately one with universal consciousness. The Buddhist teaching of interdependence points toward the recognition that nothing exists in isolation, that all phenomena arise in dependence upon multiple causes and conditions. Even the Western philosophical tradition includes thinkers like Spinoza who argued that individual minds are modifications of a single universal substance. Such perspectives don't eliminate the natural sadness we feel about endings, but they might place our mortality in a larger context that makes it feel less catastrophic. We remain part of processes larger than ourselves, processes that continue even when particular manifestations come to an end. The fear of death reveals something beautiful about human consciousness. It shows us how much we value experience, how deeply we are attached to the particular way awareness manifests in each individual mind. This attachment isn't a weakness to be overcome, but a natural expression of the preciousness of consciousness itself. Yet learning to hold this attachment more lightly, to appreciate the gift of awareness without clinging desperately to its particular forms, might allow us to face mortality with greater equanimity. We can love our individual experience fully while also recognizing that it participates in something larger and more enduring than any single lifetime. As we continue to explore these profound territories, we find that every insight about death opens into larger questions about the nature of consciousness, time, identity, and what it means to be aware beings in an apparently unconscious universe. The fear that seems so personal and isolating reveals itself to be connected to the deepest mysteries that any conscious being can contemplate. Perhaps the ultimate wisdom about mortality is not found in any particular answer, but in learning to live gracefully with the questions themselves. The mystery of death mirrors the mystery of life, the mystery of consciousness, the mystery of why there is something rather than nothing at all. In learning to face these mysteries with curiosity rather than terror, we might discover that the questions themselves are part of what makes existence so remarkable and precious. For now, let these reflections settle into the quiet spaces between thoughts, like gentle rain falling on receptive earth. The fear of death, however uncomfortable, points toward what we most cherish about being alive. In honouring both the fear and what it protects, we might find our way toward a more complete embrace of the extraordinary gift of conscious existence, however brief and mysterious it may be. The contemplation of mortality has long served as a gateway to what philosophers call authentic living. When we truly absorb the reality that our time is finite, something profound shifts in how we approach each day. The trivial concerns that once consumed our attention begin to fade, while what genuinely matters comes into sharper focus. This isn't morbid preoccupation, but rather a form of clarification, like adjusting the lens of a telescope until distant stars become visible. The Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard wrote extensively about what he called the sickness unto death, exploring how the awareness of our own finitude can lead either to despair or to what he termed authentic existence. For Kierkegaard, most people live in what he called the aesthetic stage, constantly seeking pleasure and distraction to avoid confronting the deeper questions of existence. Others advance to the ethical stage, living according to moral principles and social expectations. But true authenticity, he argued, comes only when we face the anxiety of our mortality directly and choose to live with passionate commitment despite the uncertainty. This progression from distraction through conformity to authenticity mirrors what many people experience when confronting their own mortality. Initially, we might try to avoid thinking about death altogether, filling our lives with endless activities and pursuits that keep us from facing the ultimate questions. When this avoidance becomes impossible, we might turn to external authorities, religious doctrines, or social conventions that promise to make sense of mortality for us. But eventually, if we're fortunate, we're called to take responsibility for our own relationship with death and life. This doesn't mean rejecting all guidance or wisdom from others, but rather integrating what we learn into a personal understanding that feels genuinely our own. We begin to live from the inside out rather than the outside in, making choices based on our deepest values rather than external expectations. This process of authentic engagement with mortality often brings unexpected gifts. People who have faced serious illness frequently report that the experience, however difficult, taught them what truly mattered in their lives. Relationships deepened, priorities clarified, and previously important concerns revealed themselves as ultimately superficial. The threat of death paradoxically awakened them to more vivid life. The hospice movement has provided remarkable insights into this process of awakening. Workers in hospice care often observe that people facing terminal illness go through predictable stages, not just of grief, but of growth. After working through initial denial and anger, many people enter what might be called a phase of essential living. They speak more honestly with loved ones, express feelings previously held back, and focus their remaining energy on what brings them genuine joy and meaning. These observations suggest that we needn't wait until facing terminal illness to benefit from this clarity. The regular contemplation of mortality, approached with wisdom rather than morbid fascination, can help us live more authentically throughout our lives. The Stoics understood this principle deeply, practicing daily meditation on death, not to become gloomy, but to appreciate more fully what they had while they had it. Consider how this awareness might transform routine interactions. The cashier at the grocery store, the neighbour walking their dog, the family member who calls during a busy day, all become fellow travellers on the same brief journey through consciousness. This recognition doesn't necessarily make us more sentimental, but it might make us more present, more willing to offer genuine attention and kindness to others who share our condition. The existentialist philosophers explored these themes extensively in the 20th century. Jean-Paul Sartre spoke of bad faith, the tendency to live as if we had no choice in how we respond to our circumstances. We pretend that external forces completely determine our actions, avoiding the anxiety that comes with recognizing our fundamental freedom. But the awareness of death, Sartre argued, strips away these comfortable illusions and confronts us with the reality of our choices. This confrontation with choice can be terrifying. If we're truly free to choose how we respond to our mortality, then we're also responsible for those choices. We can't blame our parents, our society, or our circumstances for how we decide to live in the face of death. This responsibility feels overwhelming until we recognize it as also being profoundly empowering. Within the constraints of our circumstances, we retain the freedom to choose our attitude, our values, and our responses. Viktor Frankl discovered this freedom even in the concentration camps, observing that while external conditions could be controlled by others, the internal response to those conditions remained within each individual's power. Some prisoners became bitter and cruel, while others maintained compassion and dignity. The difference lay not in their circumstances, but in their chosen response to those circumstances. This insight has profound implications for how we approach mortality anxiety. We cannot choose whether we will die, but we can choose how we live with that knowledge. We can allow the fear to paralyze us, or we can let it motivate us toward more authentic living. We can use mortality awareness to justify nihilism and despair, or we can use it as a call to love more deeply and create more meaningfully. The choice is not made once, but renewed constantly. Each moment offers the opportunity to live authentically, or to retreat into distraction and avoidance. The awareness of death becomes not a burden but a teacher, continually reminding us to ask whether our current choices align with what we most deeply value. This doesn't mean living with constant intensity or drama. Authentic living in the face of mortality often looks quite ordinary from the outside. It might mean listening more carefully when a friend needs to talk, spending less time on activities that drain our energy without providing genuine satisfaction, or expressing appreciation more freely to those we care about. The changes are often subtle but profound. The Japanese have a concept called ikigai, often translated as reason for being or life's purpose. But ikigai is more nuanced than simply finding a grand mission or career calling. It refers to the intersection of what you love, what you're good at, what the world needs, and what you can be paid for. This intersection creates a sweet spot where life feels both meaningful and sustainable. The awareness of mortality often helps clarify our ikigai by stripping away the non-essential elements that can obscure our deeper purposes. When we truly grasp that our time is limited, we become less willing to spend it on activities that don't connect to our core values and natural gifts. This doesn't necessarily mean dramatic career changes or lifestyle overhauls, but rather a gradual alignment of how we spend our time with what we most deeply care about. The relationship between mortality awareness and creativity deserves special attention. Throughout history, some of the greatest artistic achievements have emerged from direct engagement with themes of death and impermanence. But even more broadly, the knowledge that our time is limited seems to intensify the creative impulse. We want to make something, to leave some trace of our inner world, to transform our temporary experience into something that might outlast our individual existence. This creative response to mortality doesn't require artistic talent in the conventional sense. The parent who creates a loving home environment, the teacher who inspires curiosity in students, the friend who brings joy to social gatherings, all are expressing this same impulse to transform their temporary presence into something meaningful and lasting. We're all artists of experience, shaping the raw material of daily life into something that reflects our deepest understanding and values. The contemporary poet Mary Oliver captured this beautifully in her work, often focusing on the natural world as a teacher about mortality and meaning. Her poems frequently explore how the awareness of death can awaken us to the extraordinary beauty present in ordinary moments. A walk in the woods, the observation of birds, the changing of seasons, all become opportunities for profound recognition when approached with the understanding that both the observer and the observed are temporary manifestations of something larger. This aesthetic response to mortality suggests that beauty itself might be partly a response to impermanence. We find sunsets beautiful, partly because they don't last. We treasure moments of connection, partly because we know they will end. The poignancy that accompanies much of what we find most moving seems to arise from the intersection of beauty and transience. The mindfulness traditions offer practical approaches to cultivating this aesthetic awareness. By learning to pay careful attention to present moment experience, we begin to notice the extraordinary richness that's always available but often overlooked. The taste of food, the feeling of air on skin, the play of light and shadow, the sounds of ordinary life, all reveal themselves as miraculous when approached with genuine presence. This mindful attention to immediate experience offers a counterbalance to mortality anxiety. While part of our mind might be worrying about future dissolution, another part can be fully engaged with the vivid reality of what's happening right now. This present moment awareness doesn't eliminate thoughts about death, but it provides a refuge where we can rest from those thoughts when they become overwhelming. The practice of gratitude emerges naturally from this combination of mortality awareness and present moment attention. When we truly grasp how temporary our experience is, the fact that we have any experience at all begins to feel like an extraordinary gift. The simple ability to see colour, to hear music, to feel warmth, to connect with others, all become sources of wonder rather than things we take for granted. This gratitude extends beyond personal experience to encompass the larger web of relationships and conditions that make our existence possible. The countless generations of ancestors who survived long enough to reproduce, the vast networks of cooperation that provide our food and shelter, the incredible complexity of biological and social systems that sustain life, all become objects of appreciation when viewed through the lens of mortality awareness. Yet this gratitude need not be naive or sentimental. It can coexist with clear-eyed recognition of suffering, injustice, and the genuine difficulties of existence. The fact that life is temporary and often painful doesn't negate the wonder that it exists at all. If anything, the presence of suffering might make moments of joy and connection even more precious. The Zen tradition speaks of this as the great matter of life and death, recognizing mortality not as a problem to be solved, but as the fundamental koan or spiritual puzzle that gives shape to human existence. The practice is not to find a final answer, but to live fully within the question, allowing the awareness of impermanence to inform every aspect of how we engage with life. This living within the question requires what might be called spiritual maturity. It means being able to hold uncertainty without immediately reaching for premature closure. It means accepting that some aspects of existence will remain mysterious no matter how much we learn or think about them. It means finding peace not in having all the answers, but in being present to whatever arises. The development of this capacity often comes through what spiritual teachers call befriending our mortality anxiety, rather than trying to eliminate it. Instead of seeing the fear of death as an enemy to be conquered, we can learn to see it as a teacher pointing us toward what we most value. The intensity of our fear might reflect the intensity of our love for life, for consciousness, for the people and experiences that matter most to us. This befriending process doesn't happen overnight. It requires patience with ourselves as we oscillate between moments of acceptance and periods of resistance. Some days we might feel at peace with our mortality, while other days the anxiety returns with full force. This fluctuation is natural and doesn't represent failure or regression. Learning to live wisely with mortality is a lifelong practice, not an achievement we can complete once and for all. The support of others who are engaged in similar exploration can be invaluable in this process. While each person must ultimately face their own mortality alone, the journey toward that solitary encounter can be enriched by connection with others who understand the territory. Whether through formal spiritual communities, philosophy discussion groups, or simply honest conversations with friends and family, sharing our mortality concerns can help them feel less isolating and overwhelming. This communal dimension of mortality work reminds us that while death might be individual, the process of learning to live with that knowledge is inherently social. We discover who we are partly through relationships with others who are facing the same fundamental questions. The fear of death connects us to the deepest aspects of shared humanity, creating possibilities for connection that transcend surface differences. As we continue to explore these profound territories, we find that the question of mortality opens into every other significant human concern. How we understand death shapes how we approach love, work, creativity, and meaning. The anxiety we feel about our own ending reflects the depth of our engagement with existence itself. Rather than trying to resolve these questions definitively, perhaps the wisest approach is to learn to live gracefully within their embrace. The fear of death, the love of life, the search for meaning, the experience of beauty, the longing for connection, all weave together into the complex tapestry of human consciousness confronting its own temporary nature. In this ongoing dance between mortality and meaning, between anxiety and acceptance, we might discover that the questions themselves are part of what makes existence so remarkable. To be creatures who can contemplate our own ending, who can feel terror and wonder about the mystery of consciousness, who can create beauty in response to impermanence, this itself might be answer enough to the riddle of why we exist at all. For now, let these reflections settle into the quiet spaces of contemplation, like seeds planted in fertile darkness. The journey of understanding mortality is not one we complete, but one we continue, moment by moment, choice by choice, breath by breath, in the extraordinary gift of this temporary awareness we call life. The exploration of mortality reveals layers within layers, each more profound than the last. When we examine our fear of death closely, we discover that it often masks deeper anxieties about the nature of existence itself. What disturbs us is not merely the prospect of non-being, but the recognition that consciousness, this most intimate aspect of our experience, might be far more fragile and mysterious than we dare to acknowledge. Consider the peculiar nature of awareness itself. Right now, as these words form in your mind, there is something that experiences the forming. This experiencing presence seems so fundamental, so obviously real, that we rarely question what it actually is. Yet neuroscience tells us that consciousness emerges from the electrical and chemical activity of billions of neurons, none of which are themselves conscious. How does the wetware of the brain give rise to the felt sense of being someone? This question becomes more than academic when we face mortality. If consciousness is indeed nothing more than neural activity, then death represents the complete cessation of everything we are. The lights go out and there is no one left to experience the darkness. This materialist view of consciousness can intensify death anxiety by suggesting that our most precious possession, our inner life, is utterly dependent on biological processes that will inevitably fail. Yet even within materialist frameworks, there are reasons to find some comfort. The physicist Carlo Rovelli has written beautifully about how our atoms will continue their dance long after the particular pattern we call ourselves has dissolved. The carbon in our bodies will become part of trees, the calcium in our bones will strengthen future creatures, the iron in our blood will flow through other veins. We are not separate from the physical universe, but temporary arrangements of its matter, briefly organised into patterns capable of love and wonder. This perspective doesn't provide the personal immortality that might ease our fears, but it does place us within a larger continuity. We are not aliens visiting a foreign universe, but expressions of the cosmos itself. When we die, we don't disappear from existence, but return to the reservoir of matter and energy from which we arose. Our atoms have been part of countless other beings before us, and will be part of countless more after we're gone. The ancient Greek philosopher Democritus, who first proposed atomic theory over 2,000 years ago, found great peace in this understanding. He taught that death is nothing to us, because we are composed of atoms that are themselves indestructible. What we call death is simply the dissolution of a particular atomic arrangement. The atoms themselves continue unchanged, ready to form new patterns of organisation. Modern quantum physics adds another layer to this picture. At the subatomic level, the boundaries between individual particles become fuzzy. Electrons exist in probability clouds rather than definite locations. Particles can be entangled across vast distances, somehow remaining connected in ways that challenge our ordinary understanding of separate existence. While we should be cautious about drawing too many conclusions from quantum mechanics about consciousness, these discoveries do suggest that the universe is far stranger and more interconnected than our everyday experience suggests. The philosopher of mind David Chalmers has written extensively about what he calls the hard problem of consciousness. Even if we can explain all the neural correlates of awareness, the question remains, why is there something it is like to be conscious? Why doesn't the brain simply process information without any subjective experience accompanying that processing? The fact that there is an inner dimension to existence seems to require explanation beyond purely physical accounts. This hard problem of consciousness becomes intimately relevant when we contemplate death. If subjective experience is somehow fundamental to the universe, rather than merely emergent from complex arrangements of matter, then perhaps consciousness doesn't simply disappear when brains cease functioning. This doesn't necessarily mean personal survival after death, but it might suggest that the capacity for experience itself is more basic and enduring than individual minds. The philosopher Philip Goff has proposed what's called panpsychism, the view that consciousness is a fundamental feature of reality, present in some form throughout nature. From this perspective, human consciousness might be a particularly rich and integrated form of something that exists at every level of the physical world. If this view is correct, then death might involve not the annihilation of consciousness, but its return to simpler, more distributed forms. These philosophical speculations offer comfort to some and seem far-fetched to others. What's important is not whether any particular theory is correct, but that they remind us how much mystery surrounds consciousness and death. Our fear might be based on assumptions about the nature of mind that are themselves uncertain. The materialist view that consciousness is purely brain-dependent, while scientifically respectable, is not the only reasonable position available. The near-death experience research conducted by scientists like Pim van Lommel and Sam Parnia has documented cases where people report vivid conscious experiences during periods when their brains show no measurable activity. While these reports remain controversial and admit of various interpretations, they do challenge simple assumptions about the relationship between consciousness and brain function. At minimum, they suggest that our understanding of how awareness relates to neural activity is still incomplete. Even setting aside questions about survival after death, the mystery of consciousness in life offers a different way of approaching mortality anxiety. If we don't fully understand what consciousness is or how it arises, then perhaps we also don't fully understand what we might be losing when we die. The fear of death might be partly based on incomplete knowledge about what we actually are. This uncertainty can work both ways. It might mean that death is less catastrophic than we imagine, but it might also mean that consciousness is more precious and vulnerable than we realise. The appropriate response might be neither complacency nor terror, but rather a kind of humble wonder at the mystery we find ourselves embedded within. The contemplative traditions have long emphasised direct investigation of consciousness through meditation and introspection. While such practices don't provide scientific proof about the nature of mind, they do offer experiential insights that can inform our relationship with mortality. Many experienced meditators report that sustained attention to consciousness reveals it to be more spacious and less personal than ordinary experience suggests. In deep meditative states, the usual sense of being a separate self located in a particular body often fades, replaced by a more expansive awareness that doesn't seem to depend on individual identity. These experiences don't prove anything definitive about what happens after death, but they do suggest that our ordinary sense of selfhood might be more constructed and flexible than we usually imagine. The neuroscientist Judson Brewer has studied the brain activity of experienced meditators and found that certain regions associated with self-referential thinking become much less active during profound meditative states. This suggests that the sense of being a separate self might indeed be more like a mental construction than a fundamental fact about consciousness. If this is true, then death might involve not the destruction of our essential nature, but the dissolution of a particular way of organising experience. Such insights can provide some relief from mortality anxiety by suggesting that what we fear losing might be less solid and permanent than we imagine. The self that worries about dying might itself be more like a temporary pattern than an enduring entity. This doesn't eliminate the natural sadness we feel about endings, but it might make those endings feel less catastrophic. The practice of loving-kindness meditation offers another approach to mortality anxiety by emphasizing our connections with other beings. When we systematically cultivate feelings of goodwill toward ourselves, loved ones, neutral people, difficult people, and eventually all beings, we begin to experience ourselves as part of a larger web of consciousness rather than as isolated individuals. This sense of interconnection doesn't depend on any particular metaphysical beliefs about consciousness or survival after death. Even from a purely secular perspective, the recognition that we exist in relationship with others can provide some comfort in the face of mortality. Our individual deaths don't sever all the connections we've formed or eliminate all the influences we've had on others. The ripple effects of a single life extend far beyond what any individual can track or measure. A kind word offered at the right moment might change the trajectory of someone's day, which might influence how they interact with others, which might create further ripples extending outward in ways that are ultimately impossible to trace. From this perspective, no life is truly isolated, and no death eliminates all traces of a person's influence on the world. The evolutionary biologist Richard Dawkins has written about what he calls memes, units of cultural transmission that spread from mind to mind, much as genes spread from body to body. Ideas, practices, artistic expressions, and ways of understanding the world all function as memes that can outlast the individuals who first carried them. In this sense, part of what we are continues beyond biological death through the cultural impact we have on others. This mimetic form of immortality might not satisfy our desire for personal survival, but it does suggest that death is not as complete a termination as we might fear. The thoughts we think, the love we express, the examples we set, all become part of the ongoing human conversation about how to live well. We participate in processes of meaning-making that extend far beyond individual lifetimes. The psychologist Ernest Becker wrote extensively about how much of human behaviour can be understood as attempts to achieve what he called symbolic immortality. We create works of art, build institutions, raise children, and pursue achievements partly as ways of ensuring that something of us will survive bodily death. These immortality projects can become problematic when they lead to rigid thinking or conflict with others who have different approaches to transcending mortality. Yet Becker also recognised that some form of immortality striving seems to be inevitable for beings who are aware of their own mortality. The key is finding ways of pursuing symbolic immortality that enhance, rather than diminish, our capacity for love, creativity, and genuine connection with others. The artist who creates beauty, the teacher who inspires students, the parent who raises children with wisdom and care, all are engaging in forms of transcendence that serve both personal and collective flourishing. The philosopher Hans Jonas wrote about what he called the imperative of responsibility, arguing that our technological power has created new ethical obligations to future generations. We now have the capacity to affect the conditions of life for people who won't be born for centuries. This expanded temporal perspective can provide a different context for mortality anxiety by connecting our brief lives to much longer timescales. When we consider our responsibilities to future generations, our own deaths become part of a larger story about the continuity of human life and culture. We are temporary custodians of traditions, knowledge, and natural resources that we receive from previous generations and must pass on to those who come after us. This custodial role provides a sense of purpose that transcends individual mortality while acknowledging its reality. The environmental movement has brought particular urgency to questions about intergenerational responsibility. Climate change, biodiversity loss, and other global challenges confront us with the reality that our choices today will affect the conditions of life for countless future beings. This expanded sense of moral consideration can transform mortality anxiety into a different kind of concern about the legacy we leave behind. Rather than focusing primarily on our own survival, we might direct our attention toward ensuring that future generations have the opportunity to experience the beauty and wonder that have made our own lives meaningful. This shift in perspective doesn't eliminate the sadness of personal ending, but it can provide a sense of purpose that makes mortality feel less like pure loss. The astrophysicist Carl Sagan captured this perspective beautifully in his reflections on humanity's place in the cosmos. He emphasized that we are made of star stuff, literally composed of elements forged in ancient stellar furnaces. Our brief lives represent moments when the universe becomes conscious of itself, when matter organized into patterns capable of wonder and love. From this cosmic perspective, individual death is sad but not tragic, part of the natural rhythm by which the universe explores its own possibilities. This scientific spirituality offers a framework for approaching mortality that is both realistic about death and wonder-filled about life. We need not believe in personal survival after death to find meaning and beauty in our temporary existence as conscious beings. The fact that consciousness arose at all from the dance of atoms and energy seems miraculous enough to justify gratitude and wonder, even in the face of individual mortality. The contemporary philosopher Rebecca Neuberger-Goldstein has written about what she calls the view from nowhere, the capacity of human consciousness to transcend its particular perspective and consider reality from an objective standpoint. This ability to step outside our immediate experience and contemplate the larger context of existence is one of the most remarkable features of human awareness. When we apply this capacity to questions of mortality, we can see our individual deaths as part of larger patterns that are both natural and meaningful. Species evolve and go extinct, stars are born and die, galaxies form and dissolve, yet the underlying creativity of the universe continues. Our participation in these cosmic processes gives our lives significance, even when our individual stories come to an end. This view from nowhere doesn't eliminate the very real sadness we feel about personal ending and loss. The objective perspective that can find meaning in cosmic processes is still held by particular beings who love their individual existence and grieve its passing. The tension between these perspectives, between the personal and the cosmic, might be one of the defining characteristics of human consciousness. Learning to hold both perspectives simultaneously, to feel fully the sadness of mortality while also appreciating the larger patterns of which we are part, might represent a form of wisdom particularly suited to beings like ourselves. We are neither purely individual nor purely cosmic, but something in between, capable of caring deeply about particular relationships and experiences while also recognizing their place in larger wholes. The practice of philosophy itself can be understood as a way of cultivating this dual perspective. When we think carefully about fundamental questions, we temporarily transcend our immediate concerns and participate in conversations that extend across centuries and cultures. The questions that kept Socrates awake at night continue to puzzle and inspire us today. In engaging with these timeless concerns, we connect with something that transcends individual mortality, even while remaining fully human. As we continue to explore these profound territories, we discover that every approach to mortality opens into questions about the nature of consciousness, identity, meaning, and our place in the larger scheme of things. The fear that initially seemed so personal and isolating reveals itself to be connected to the deepest mysteries that any aware being can contemplate. Perhaps the ultimate insight about mortality anxiety is that it reflects something beautiful about consciousness itself. We fear death partly because we are capable of love, wonder, and deep engagement with existence. The intensity of our mortality anxiety might be directly proportional to the intensity of our capacity for meaning and connection. In this light, the fear becomes not a weakness to be overcome, but a signal to be honoured, pointing us toward what we most value in our brief time as conscious beings. The journey of understanding mortality continues throughout our lives, deepening and evolving as we accumulate experience and wisdom. There are no final answers to these questions, only opportunities for continued exploration and growth. In learning to live gracefully with uncertainty about death, we might also learn to live more fully with the mystery and wonder of consciousness itself. For now, let these reflections rest gently in the quiet spaces of your awareness, like seeds planted in the fertile darkness of contemplation. The questions we've explored together tonight are not problems to be solved, but invitations to deeper engagement with the extraordinary gift of conscious existence, however temporary and mysterious it may be. The wisdom traditions across cultures have long recognized that our relationship with mortality shapes not just how we die, but how we live. The ancient Egyptians spent lifetimes preparing elaborate tombs and mummification processes, not out of morbid obsession, but from a deep understanding that how we approach death reflects our most fundamental beliefs about what makes life meaningful. Their pyramids and burial chambers weren't monuments to death, but testimonies to the preciousness of conscious existence. In medieval Europe, the tradition of ars moriendi, or the art of dying well, flourished among both religious and secular communities. These weren't grim preparations for inevitable doom, but sophisticated philosophical frameworks for living with greater purpose and clarity. The practitioners understood that learning to die well meant learning to live well, that facing mortality directly could illuminate what deserved attention and what could be safely ignored. The Japanese concept of mono no aware, often translated as the bittersweet awareness of impermanence, offers another cultural lens through which to view mortality. Rather than treating death as an enemy to be defeated or denied, this aesthetic philosophy finds profound beauty in the transient nature of all things. The cherry blossoms are most beautiful precisely because they fall, the autumn leaves most moving because they cannot stay green forever. This aesthetic approach to mortality suggests that our fear might sometimes arise from misunderstanding the nature of beauty itself. We often assume that permanence is necessary for significance, that something must last forever to be truly valuable. Yet much of what moves us most deeply in art, music, and literature derives its power from the recognition of impermanence. The symphony is beautiful, partly because it unfolds in time and then ends, the poem meaningful partly because it captures a fleeting moment of insight. Consider how this shifts our understanding of human relationships. The love between parent and child gains some of its intensity from the knowledge that childhood is brief, that these particular moments of dependence and wonder will not last. The friendship that deepens over decades becomes more precious as we recognize that our time together is not infinite. Even romantic love, perhaps especially romantic love, draws some of its passionate quality from the awareness that both lovers are mortal beings whose time together is limited and irreplaceable. This doesn't mean we should become sentimental or maudlin about every interaction. Rather, it suggests that a mature awareness of mortality can infuse ordinary moments with a quality of attention and appreciation that might otherwise remain dormant. The shared meal becomes more than just nutrition, the conversation more than just information exchange, the quiet companionship more than just the absence of solitude. The Stoic Emperor Marcus Aurelius, writing in his private journal during military campaigns along the Roman frontier, repeatedly returned to themes of mortality, not to frighten himself, but to clarify his priorities. He reminded himself that the angry citizen who complained about taxes, the ambitious senator who sought power, the wealthy merchant who accumulated possessions, all were fellow travellers on the same journey toward death. This recognition didn't make him cold or indifferent, but rather more patient and compassionate. When we truly grasp that everyone we encounter is facing the same fundamental uncertainty about mortality, something shifts in how we relate to others. The person who cuts in front of us in traffic, the colleague who seems unreasonably demanding, the family member who holds different political views, all are beings grappling with the same ultimate questions we face. This shared condition doesn't excuse harmful behaviour, but it might inspire a different quality of understanding. The Buddhist teacher Pema Chodron speaks of what she calls the genuine heart of sadness, a quality of openness and tenderness that can arise when we stop trying to protect ourselves from the reality of impermanence. This sadness isn't depression or despair, but rather a kind of vulnerable appreciation for the precious and fragile nature of everything we encounter. It's the sadness that comes not from loss, but from love, not from ending, but from beginning. This genuine heart of sadness can transform our relationship with mortality anxiety. Instead of seeing our fear of death as something to be overcome or eliminated, we might learn to recognize it as an expression of how much we value consciousness, connection, and meaning. The very intensity of our mortality anxiety reflects the depth of our engagement with existence. We fear death partly because we love life so fully, yet this love of life need not become desperate clinging. The mindfulness traditions teach the difference between appreciation and attachment, between loving fully and grasping tightly. We can open our hearts completely to the beauty and meaning we encounter, while simultaneously accepting that all things change and pass away. This isn't emotional numbness, but rather emotional maturity, the capacity to love without the anxiety that comes from trying to make permanent what is inherently impermanent. The practice of meditation offers practical training in this kind of open-hearted acceptance. When we sit quietly and observe our breath, we're practicing letting go thousands of times. Each inhale arises and passes away, each exhale emerges and dissolves. We don't try to hold on to any particular breath or push away the ones that feel uncomfortable. We simply allow the natural rhythm of breathing to continue, learning to rest in the flow rather than fighting the current. This same quality of awareness can be brought to thoughts and emotions, including thoughts about death and feelings of mortality anxiety. When fear arises, we can notice it without immediately trying to fix it or make it go away. We can observe how the fear feels in the body, what thoughts accompany it, how it changes over time. Often, this simple witnessing transforms our relationship with the fear, even when it doesn't eliminate the fear entirely. The contemporary teacher Tara Brach speaks of what she calls radical acceptance, the practice of saying yes to whatever is arising in our experience without immediately trying to change or improve it. This doesn't mean passive resignation, but rather a kind of courageous presence that can meet whatever appears with curiosity and compassion. When applied to mortality anxiety, radical acceptance might mean allowing ourselves to feel the fear fully while also recognizing that we are larger than any particular emotion. This practice of acceptance often reveals something surprising about mortality anxiety. When we stop fighting the fear and instead investigate it with genuine interest, we often discover that it contains within it not just terror but also love. Not just anxiety about ending, but also appreciation for what we have now. The fear of losing something precious can awaken us to how precious it actually is. The hospice movement has provided remarkable insights into this process of acceptance. Workers who spend their days with dying patients often report that the individuals who seem most at peace are not those who deny death's approach, but those who face it with curiosity and openness. They ask questions about what might come next, express their fears and hopes, say what needs to be said to loved ones, and find ways to appreciate whatever time remains. These observations suggest that the goal isn't to eliminate mortality anxiety, but to develop a wiser relationship with it. We can acknowledge the fear while not being completely controlled by it. We can use the awareness of death as motivation for authentic living without becoming paralysed by morbid preoccupation. We can love deeply while holding lightly, invest fully while accepting impermanence. The German poet Rainer Maria Rilke wrote extensively about what he called living the questions, suggesting that some aspects of existence are too profound to admit of easy answers. Rather than demanding premature closure on life's deepest mysteries, Rilke invited us to dwell patiently within uncertainty, allowing the questions themselves to shape and transform us. This approach seems particularly relevant to mortality, which remains mysterious despite all our philosophical and scientific investigation. Living the questions of mortality might mean accepting that we don't and perhaps can't know with certainty what happens after death. It might mean acknowledging that consciousness itself remains largely mysterious despite all our neuroscientific advances. It might mean recognizing that the meaning of individual existence within cosmic processes is something each person must discover for themselves, rather than something that can be definitively proven or disproven. This tolerance for uncertainty requires what the poet John Keats called negative capability, the ability to remain in doubt and uncertainty without irritably reaching after fact and reason. In the context of mortality, negative capability might mean being comfortable with not knowing exactly what we are or what happens when we die, while still finding profound meaning and beauty in the fact that we exist at all. The practice of negative capability doesn't require abandoning all beliefs or investigations about death and consciousness. Rather, it involves holding our beliefs lightly, remaining open to new information and different perspectives, and recognizing the limits of what any individual mind can comprehend about existence itself. This intellectual humility can be profoundly liberating, freeing us from the burden of having to solve unsolvable mysteries before we can live authentically. The contemporary philosopher Thomas Nagel has written about what he calls the absurd, the collision between human need for meaning and the universe's apparent silence about ultimate purpose. Death epitomizes this absurdity by confronting our deep desire for continuity with the brute fact of ending. Yet Nagel suggests that recognizing absurdity need not lead to despair, but rather to a kind of ironic engagement with existence. We can throw ourselves fully into our projects, relationships, and creative endeavors, while simultaneously recognizing that from a cosmic perspective, these activities might seem utterly insignificant. This double consciousness, this ability to take our lives seriously while also maintaining perspective on their ultimate smallness, might represent a particularly human form of wisdom. The absurdist approach to mortality doesn't promise easy comfort or definitive answers. Instead, it invites us to find meaning in the very act of creating meaning, to discover purpose in the ongoing human project of making sense of existence. We might be brief sparks in a vast cosmos, but we are sparks capable of love, wonder, creativity, and moral reflection. Perhaps that's enough. This perspective echoes themes found in existentialist philosophy, which emphasized human freedom to create values and meaning, even in the apparent absence of predetermined purpose. From this view, the fact that life ends doesn't negate its significance, but rather makes our choices about how to live all the more important. We are free to decide what deserves our attention, what values we want to embody, what kind of trace we want to leave in the ongoing human story. The freedom to choose our response to mortality can feel overwhelming, but it's also profoundly empowering. We cannot control whether we'll die, but we retain significant influence over how we live with that knowledge. We can use mortality awareness to justify nihilism and withdrawal, or we can use it as motivation for deeper engagement and more authentic expression. The choice is ours to make, again and again, in each moment of conscious existence. This ongoing choice between different responses to mortality might be one of the defining features of human maturity. Children live mostly in the present, largely unconscious of their own mortality. Adolescents become aware of death but often respond with either reckless disregard or paralyzing anxiety. Adults gradually learn to live with mortality awareness in ways that enhance rather than diminish their capacity for meaning and connection. This maturation process doesn't follow a linear trajectory. Even those who seem to have made peace with mortality will experience moments of renewed anxiety, particularly during times of illness, loss, or major life transitions. The goal isn't to achieve a permanent state of acceptance, but to develop greater resilience and wisdom, in how we navigate the ongoing dance between life and death awareness. The support of community can be invaluable in this process. While each person must ultimately face their own mortality alone, the journey toward that solitary encounter can be greatly enriched by connection with others who understand the territory. Whether through formal spiritual or philosophical communities, support groups for those facing illness, or simply honest conversations with friends and family, sharing our mortality concerns can help them feel less isolating and overwhelming. These conversations about death and meaning often reveal how much we have in common beneath surface differences. The wealthy and the poor, the educated and the unschooled, the religious and the secular, all face the same fundamental questions about what it means to be a conscious being in a temporary form. These shared concerns can create bonds that transcend many of the divisions that ordinarily separate us. The philosopher Emmanuel Levinas wrote about encountering the face of the other as a fundamental ethical experience. For Levinas, seeing another person's face meant recognizing their vulnerability, their mortality, their need for care and respect. This recognition of shared fragility becomes the foundation of all genuine moral relationship. We care for others partly because we recognize that they, like us, are temporary beings trying to make sense of their brief time in consciousness. This ethical dimension of mortality awareness has profound implications for how we organize societies and make collective decisions. When we truly grasp that everyone we encounter is facing the same ultimate uncertainty, policies and practices that increase suffering or diminish opportunity become harder to justify. The recognition of universal mortality doesn't automatically resolve all moral questions, but it does provide a common foundation for ethical reflection. The environmental movement has brought particular urgency to questions about collective mortality. Climate change and ecological destruction confront us with the possibility that human civilization itself might be temporary, that our species could face extinction within a relatively short time frame. This expanded mortality awareness can motivate greater care for the conditions of life and deeper consideration of our responsibilities to future generations. Yet even these ultimate concerns about species survival occur within the context of cosmic processes that are far larger than human timescales. Stars will continue to burn long after humanity has disappeared, galaxies will keep spinning long after our star has died, and the universe itself will continue expanding long after all the stars have burned out. Our individual mortality is embedded within collective mortality, which is embedded within cosmic processes that dwarf all terrestrial concerns. This nested understanding of mortality, from individual through species to cosmic levels, can provide perspective on our fears, while also highlighting what makes consciousness so remarkable. For a brief moment in cosmic history, matter has organized itself into patterns capable of love, wonder, creativity, and moral reflection. The fact that these patterns are temporary doesn't diminish their significance but might actually enhance it. We are witnesses to the universe becoming aware of itself, participants in the cosmic process of self-reflection and understanding. Through human consciousness, the cosmos contemplates its own nature, questions its own meaning, and creates beauty in response to its own mystery. This participation in cosmic self-awareness gives our brief lives a significance that transcends individual mortality, while fully acknowledging its reality. As we continue to explore these profound territories, we find that every insight about mortality opens into larger questions about consciousness, time, meaning, and our place in the vast unfolding story of existence. The fear that initially seemed so personal and isolating reveals itself to be intimately connected to the deepest mysteries that any aware being can contemplate. The journey of understanding mortality is not one we complete, but one we continue, deepening our appreciation for the extraordinary gift of consciousness while accepting its temporary nature. In learning to live gracefully with the questions surrounding death, we might also learn to live more fully with the wonder and mystery of being aware at all. For now, let these reflections settle into the quiet depths of your contemplation, like gentle rain soaking into receptive earth. The fear of death, however uncomfortable, points toward what we most treasure about existence itself. In honouring both the anxiety and what it protects, we might discover pathways toward a more complete embrace of our remarkable, temporary, and infinitely precious conscious experience. The contemplation of our mortality reveals something extraordinary about human consciousness, that sets us apart from every other form of life we know. We alone among Earth's creatures possess the peculiar gift and burden of being able to imagine our own non-existence. A deer drinking from a stream lives fully in the present moment, alert to immediate dangers but unburdened by abstract knowledge of its eventual fate. We, however, carry within us the constant awareness that this breath, this heartbeat, this moment of awareness itself will one day cease forever. This unique capacity for mortality awareness shapes human experience in ways both profound and subtle. It influences the urgency with which we pursue our goals, the depth of meaning we find in relationships, and the intensity with which we experience beauty. A sunset moves us partly because we know we will witness only a finite number of them. A child's laughter touches something deep within us because we understand how brief childhood is, how quickly those carefree days will pass into memory. Yet this same awareness that enriches our experience also creates what we might call the existential weight of being human. Unlike other animals who respond to immediate threats with instinctive fear, we carry a background anxiety about ultimate dissolution that can colour every moment of our lives. This isn't pathological, but rather a natural consequence of consciousness, sophisticated enough to contemplate its own boundaries. The philosopher Gabriel Marcel distinguished between problems and mysteries in human experience. Problems are questions that can be solved through analysis and investigation. Mysteries are realities so fundamental that we cannot step outside them to examine them objectively. Death, Marcel suggested, is the ultimate mystery because we cannot experience it, and remain present to reflect on that experience. We can study the biological processes of dying, the social rituals surrounding death, the psychological responses to mortality, but the essential nature of death itself remains forever beyond direct investigation. This mysterious quality of death creates a unique form of anxiety. We fear the unknown, but death represents the unknowable. We can prepare for many of life's challenges by gathering information, developing skills, or no living person can tell us what death is seeking advice from others who have faced similar situations. But actually, because the very act of dying removes them from the conversation, we must each approach this ultimate threshold without benefit of first-hand reports from those who have crossed it. The silence that surrounds death has given rise to elaborate mythologies and religious systems throughout human history. Every culture has developed stories about what happens after we die, from ancient Egyptian journeys through the underworld to modern near-death experience accounts. These narratives serve many functions, but perhaps most importantly they attempt to fill the void of unknowing with familiar images and concepts. The afterlife becomes a place we can imagine, populated by beings we can relate to, governed by rules we can understand. Yet beneath even the most elaborate theological systems lies the fundamental mystery that no amount of doctrine can fully resolve. Whether we believe in heaven or reincarnation, in dissolution into cosmic consciousness or simple annihilation, we must acknowledge that our beliefs about death remain matters of faith rather than knowledge. This uncertainty can intensify our mortality anxiety by leaving us suspended between hope and fear, unable to find solid ground on which to rest our concerns. The existentialist tradition has embraced this uncertainty as a fundamental condition of human existence, rather than a problem to be solved. Jean-Paul Sartre wrote about being thrown into existence without our choosing, forced to make meaning in a universe that provides no predetermined purpose or direction. From this perspective, mortality anxiety becomes not a flaw in human psychology, but an inevitable consequence of consciousness confronting its own contingency. Albert Camus explored similar themes through his analysis of the absurd, the conflict between human desire for meaning and the universe's apparent indifference to our concerns. Death epitomizes this absurdity by confronting our deep longing for continuity with the stark reality of ending. Yet Camus didn't counsel despair, but rather a kind of defiant engagement with existence. He suggested we should imagine Sisyphus happy, finding joy in the very act of living despite the ultimate futility of all human endeavours. This absurdist approach to mortality offers neither comfort nor false hope, but rather a framework for authentic engagement with our condition. We can acknowledge that death makes all our projects ultimately meaningless from a cosmic perspective while still finding profound significance in the lived experience of pursuing those projects. The temporary nature of our existence doesn't negate its value. but might actually intensify it by creating urgency and focus. Consider how this perspective might transform our relationship with everyday activities. The work we do, the relationships we build, the art we create, all become more precious when we understand that they exist within the boundaries of finite time. This doesn't mean we should live in constant awareness of mortality, but rather that occasional remembrance of our temporal condition can clarify what deserves our attention and energy. The Tibetan Buddhist tradition has developed sophisticated practices for working directly with mortality anxiety. The contemplation of death is considered one of the fundamental meditations, not to induce morbid preoccupation, but to develop what they call spiritual urgency. When we truly grasp how uncertain and brief our time is, the tradition suggests, we naturally turn toward what brings genuine happiness and meaning, rather than wasting energy on trivial pursuits. This spiritual urgency doesn't manifest as frantic activity, but rather as a kind of focused presence. When we remember that this conversation with a friend might be one of our last, we listen more carefully. When we recognise that this walk in the garden occurs within limited time, we notice the colours more vividly. When we understand that this moment of quiet reflection is irreplaceable, we settle into it more fully. The practice of memento mori, remembering death, has appeared in various forms across cultures and centuries. Medieval monks kept skulls on their desks as reminders of mortality. Victorian mourning jewellery incorporated a hair from deceased loved ones. Day of the Dead celebrations honour ancestors while acknowledging the continuity between life and death. These practices aren't morbid, but rather attempts to integrate awareness of mortality into daily life in healthy ways. As we reach the end of tonight's gentle exploration, let these final thoughts settle softly into the quiet spaces of your mind like snow falling on still water. We have wandered together through the labyrinth of mortality anxiety, discovering that what seems like our deepest fear might actually be our most profound teacher. The anxiety we feel about death reveals something beautiful about human consciousness. It shows us how deeply we love life, how much we cherish connection, how intensely we value this extraordinary gift of awareness itself. Rather than seeing our fear of death as something to overcome, perhaps we can learn to honour it as a compass pointing toward what matters most. For in the end, to fear death is simply another way of loving life, and that love, however temporary, makes our brief time here infinitely precious.